Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, will the Mandelson scandal bring down Keir Starmer? We have the verdict from a pretty lengthy jury trial into 6 Palestine Action activists who did an action against Elbit Systems. Quite a remarkable outcome, actually. I speak to Stephen Meffen about that. Also, the part of the Epstein files that many on the left might find the most uncomfortable, which is Chomsky's relationship to the billionaire paedophile and also Elon Musk. He's not extensively included in the Epstein files, but he has been categorically proven to have lied about his relationship with the pedo billionaire. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani.
My pleasure to be joining you, Michael. Great show last night. Hope for a better one tonight.
If you'd like to support our work, we have had a fair few new subscribers this week. Thank you so much. If you have newly signed up at novaramedia.com/support. If you haven't, what are you waiting for? You know, this show, this whole organisation is only possible because of your kind support. So do consider signing up. Peter Mandelson may finally be gone from public life. But with the peer now under police investigation, who will his downfall take with him? Now, that's the question hanging over British politics right now. And it was the only topic debated at Prime Minister's Questions today.
The political decision to appoint Epstein's close associate, Peter Mandelson, as Britain's ambassador to Washington goes to the very heart of this Prime Minister's judgment. When he made that appointment, was he aware that Mandelson had continued his friendship even after Epstein's conviction for child prostitution?
Simple question. Mr. Speaker, let me start where I must with the victims of Epstein, and all of our thoughts are with them. Can I also say our thoughts are with all those who lost jobs, savings and livelihoods in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash. To learn that there was a cabinet minister leaking sensitive information at the height of the response to the 2008 crash is beyond infuriating. And I am as angry as the public and any member of this House. Mandelson betrayed our country, our Parliament, and my party. Mr. Speaker, he lied repeatedly to my team when asked about his relationship with Epstein before and during his tenure as ambassador. I regret appointing him. If I knew then what I know now, he would never have been anywhere near government. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Cabinet Secretary, with my support, took the decision to refer material to the police. And there is now a criminal investigation. I've instructed my team to draft legislation to strip Mandelson of his title and wider legislation to remove disgraced peers. And this morning, I've agreed with His Majesty the King that Mandelson should be removed from the list of Privy Councillors on grounds that he's brought the reputation of the Privy Council into disrepute.
He might be removed from the Privy Council. Everyone's nodding furiously behind. Oh, yes, get that man off the Privy Council. It's just a crazy distraction, right? Who cares if this man gets to have the title Lord in front of his name? Who cares if he gets to sit on the Privy Council, which, I mean, he's not going to get invited to any meetings where important stuff is discussed, is it? It just seems, you know, you're arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And Keir Starmer, I'm so annoyed. I'm incredibly upset. Anyone who might be angry about this, trust me, I'm even more angry that this known manipulator is literally the Prince of Darkness, is how he has been known for 3 decades in British politics, who Keir Starmer knew had been friends with a billionaire paedophile even after he'd been convicted for sex crimes against minors. Right? He knew that they'd remained friends. But Keir Starmer still thought, you know what, I'm going to believe everything he says. Seems like a trustworthy guy. And I put so much faith into him, I cannot believe Peter Mandelson, of all people, Peter Mandelson lied to me. This is outrageous. You'd be just as furious as I am if you'd been lied to by such a seemingly upright person. Who could have guessed? You'll notice Keir Starmer didn't answer the question Kemi Badenoch put to him. She asked him again for her second question, got another vague answer. It was on her third try that she got a more concrete response.
I am asking the Prime Minister something very specific, not about the generalities of the full extent. Can the Prime Minister tell us, did the official security vetting he received mention Mandelson's ongoing relationship with the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein?
So clear.
Prime Minister.
Yes, it did. As a result, various questions were put to him. I intend to disclose to this House all of the national security, prejudice to international relations on one side. I want to make sure this House sees the full documentation, so it will see for itself the extent to which time and time again Mandelson completely misrepresented the extent of his relationship with Epstein and lied throughout the process, including in response to the due diligence.
Now, Aaron, it's a strange moment, that, because it's something everyone knew. You know, the fact that Starmer knew when he appointed Peter Mandelson to be US ambassador that he had maintained a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein after Jeffrey Epstein had gone to prison for sex offences against children. Like, that was public knowledge. But still, I suppose, Kemi Baden not getting him to explicitly say, yes, I knew that, standing at PMQs, you know, people are sort of giving it some sort of political significance. I suppose it can now go viral on social media, the fact that he said, yes, I did know, when this is now the most high salience story in the country.
You know, it wasn't that long ago, Michael, that the Labour Party in opposition was trying to get Rishi Sunak sacked because he didn't wear a seatbelt. And this guy's now saying, yeah, I knew that the man I wanted to be arguably one of the most senior figures in the British diplomatic service, this country's ambassador to Washington, I knew that he was good friends with the world's most famous paedophile. I knew that. But hey, let's talk about the seatbelt 5 years ago. That's one thing. And then secondly, Michael, and this is something we need to talk about, Karen Pierce, who was this country's ambassador to the United States, there wasn't a job available. It was perfectly plausible that she stayed in post, right? What happened was that Starmer and his faction on the Labour right wanted one of their own people in there. That's what happened. It was a factional manoeuvre. He lied to me. Why did you trust him? This is a man who's good friends not just with Epstein, but also Oleg Deripaska, who had to resign not once but twice from cabinet. His own autobiography is called The Third Man. It's a creature lurking in the shadows, the eminence grise. It's beyond parody. Mandelson has sold himself for 25 years as the slimy, conniving insider, and we have the Prime Minister at PMQ saying, I had no idea he was a slimy, conniving insider. You know, so it's either you're incredibly naive and credulous, or you're so cynical. And I think it's the latter, by the way. You are so cynical, you're playing us for fools by playing the naivety card. Nobody in the country would quiz Peter Mandelson on hugely important questions and then just take his answers at face value. Nobody, except the Prime Minister. At which point you have to ask, why? Was there motivated reasoning going on? I think there was. And if that's the case, then why should your judgment be trusted as the person that is leading this country's government?
Well, they switch between two modes, which are quite inconsistent with each other, because I suppose when they put Peter Mandelson in that position, and this is a line that's come from Morgan McSweeney and Keir Starmer and that faction quite a lot, which is to say, we aren't pearl clutchers. We like operators who can get things done. We're not actually that fussed about someone's personal morality. We're fussed about results. And we're picking Peter Mandelson because we're grown-ups, you know. We don't think that people are perfect, but we think that this kind of slimy, greasy guy can get stuff done with Donald Trump in the White House. And now they've suddenly switched up. We actually thought he was a really nice, upright, honest guy, and who could have guessed this was coming? It's like, if you want to be really consistent, Keir Starmer should stand up and say, okay, yeah, we made a gamble. We thought that we wanted an effective operator, even if they had a really terrible past, even if they were very untrustworthy, but we thought that that was going to be in the national interest for the country, and it's backfired, right? That would be honest. But instead he's saying, oh, I can't believe he betrayed my trust. You hired him because he's very effective at betraying people's trust.
It was a swing and a miss. At least say that, right? And this is something that really is central to Keir Starmer as a politician. He never takes responsibility. He'll say, my government, my government, my government. Your government made Peter Mandelson the best friend of the world's most famous paedophile, this country's ambassador to Washington. That's what your government did. but he never takes responsibility. When things go wrong, it's always other people's fault. And, that's one of the central reasons why he's one of the most unpopular prime ministers in this country's history. Do I think he's a much better prime minister than Liz Truss? Yes. Do I think he's a reasonably talented bureaucrat? Absolutely. But when it comes to actually how he aligns his emotional state, his principles with his politics, people just look at the guy and think, this is like some amoral vacuum who's delivering things, as I've often said, in need of Vicks vapor rub, some sort of some robot with a deviated septum, and that's a bad place to be, right? Having very little charisma, clearly not being driven by principle, having pitched your premiership while in opposition as one that's driven by principle and probity, and you do this. I mean, I think, Michael, I do genuinely think, and look, the media game. People love to be dramatic and hyperbolic, right? Because it gets attention, it gets eyeballs, it gets clicks. I do genuinely think this will tarnish not just Keir Starmer's reputation, but Labour's reputation for decades. When another Labour leader in opposition in 5, 10, 15 years' time talks about probity and standards in public office, they will be laughed at. They're going to be laughed at for a very long time. I know people have short memories, but I seriously think that for the next 10, 15, 20 years, this stuff is going to be a variable as to why people shouldn't trust Labour. It's a bit like the expenses scandal in 2009. Even today, that still sticks in people's minds. I suspect this will run and run and run and be very similar.
It's interesting you talk there about how when he was in opposition, he was saying that we are the principal party, we're the upstanding people, we care about the rules. Because there was always this double-edged thing. From the very beginning of Keir Starmer, there was always sort of speaking to, I suppose, the lobby and sort of people who were sort of insiders in politics and saying, we get stuff done. We're not particularly principled. We care about results. We're willing to break the rules when it comes to the Labour left. We're willing to bring on super rich funders who might have been a little bit discredited because we really want to win the next general election. And then to the general public, they're saying, we just really want to bring propriety back into politics. And I think that, they got away with that because the lobby and the mainstream media were so soft on them in opposition. But it's that double-sided, that Janus-faced element of this version of the Labour Party, which I think is why they have sort of become so unpopular so quickly, because the two things are just so inconsistent.
Yeah, and very quickly, because it's your show, Michael, tonight. But the reason why the lobby and the media went so soft on them is because Mandelson was part of a political project which was hammering the left. They loved it. They lapped it up. When Rachel Reeves was talking to the Financial Times saying, okay, the membership's going down, I want it to go down. The FT was saying, this is what sensible grown-up politics looks like. Now they don't have enough money to campaign in next year's local elections. They're broke. They've openly said we can't really afford to run a campaign for Greater Manchester Mayor if Burnham was going to run in the by-election. Partly true, by the way. They can't spend money they don't have. So there's a reason why these idiotic decisions were repeatedly made. They got away with it. And by the way, this is all much worse than anything under Boris Johnson. Much, much worse. This is the worst, I think. This is the worst scandal in British politics. People say since Profumo, the Cambridge Five, this spy ring out of Cambridge. But I think in terms of domestic politics, which is disconnected from geopolitics, foreign affairs, I think it's easily the worst scandal in this country's modern history. It's terrifying, and it's just the beginning. And the reason this wasn't investigated is because that Mandelson, Starmer, like I say, Campbell, all that retinue of post-Blair people, they were hammering a left, and they loved it. The broadcast media loved it. And I'll just say this. We often talk about the press, print media, being pro-Tory in this country. Obviously true. Historically, the Sun, the Mail, the Telegraph, pro-Tory. Some exceptions, but general rule. Broadcast media loves New Labour. And it's personal. It is personal. Angie Hunter, the wife of Adam Bolton at Sky News, she was a Blair-era spin doctor. Derek Draper, a Blair-era spin doctor, married to Kate Garraway at ITV. Philip Collins, Blair speechwriter, brother-in-law to Krishnan Guru Murphy at Channel 4. There are literally dozens of these examples that I can give. So when those people are on TV giving a soft ride to New Labour figures, there's a reason. It's got so crazy in recent years, Michael. You have Yvette Cooper being quizzed by her own husband on GMB. They've even taken it a step further about whether or not Labour's policy on this or that issue is right. So broadcast media is very, very pro. You're going to interrupt me and say that I'm being unfair, maybe on GMB, because now I think they've pulled him away from doing that in recent months. But there's a reason why broadcast media in particular was so soft on Starmer, and much of it is personal. They know each other. They went to uni together. Sometimes they sleep with each other. They're godparents to each other's kids. Peter Mandelson was the best man at the wedding of Trevor Phillips. And you have Trevor Phillips on Sunday on Sky News saying, Peter Mandelson and I are friends. You're a bit more than friends, pal.
I wasn't going to interrupt you about Good Morning Britain. I was going to go on to our next clip because the House of Commons today debated a motion put forward by the Tories to release all the files related to Mandelson's appointment as US ambassador, sort of the vetting documents and various exchanges. The Labour government then put forward an amendment to that motion, agreeing that some files could be released, but only if they weren't judged to breach national security or damage our relations with other countries. The idea of the Labour government was that senior civil servants would decide which of the files could be released and which of them should remain private. There was then, though, a big push from MPs to hand that power instead to the Intelligence and Security Committee of cross-party MPs. The relevance here is that the Intelligence and Security Committee, they have had national security vetting. So that's why they're considered to be an appropriate body to make that call. The MPs who wanted it to be the Intelligence and Security Committee included Angela Rayner.
Given the public disgust and the sickening behaviour of Peter Mandelson and the importance of transparency, in 2022 I proposed a humble address seeking information about PPE, which the party opposite resisted, and my honourable friend, the member for Hackney South, mentioned just before. Should we not have the ISC not have the same role now in keeping public confidence in the process?
So at around 4:15, the government relented and they decided that, yes, it will be or conceded, I suppose, that it would be the Intelligence and Security Committee that makes the decision on which documents are released. Aaron, this means that Downing Street now doesn't really have any control over what documents are released when it comes to their appointment of Peter Mandelson. So there could be many more embarrassing scandals to come.
I mean, you would suspect so, right? You would suspect so. Already, we're hearing about the possibility of Morgan McSweeney, protege of Peter Mandelson, Chief of Staff to Keir Starmer, having to go in order to save Keir Starmer's hide. I would suspect on the balance of probabilities when that stuff comes out, the PM is toast. People love saying that, right? People love saying that. But this is so profound a crisis, not just for the PM's judgment, but for his entire political faction. You know, there's a reason why people like Luke Akehurst, Alistair Campbell, they're not very noisy on social media right now because they're very, very worried about the broader consequences of all this.
And actually, the broader consequences could also really be who becomes the next Labour leader, right? Because that was Angela Rayner sort of holding the government's feet to the fire on the relationship between Peter Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein. Her main challenger, if she stands, which I imagine she will be Wes Streeting, who was quite close to Peter Mandelson. So I think this is not the context in which Wes Streeting would have wanted to challenge Keir Starmer. Wes Streeting would have wanted to challenge Keir Starmer when it was not really about ethics or probity. It was all about, can you win elections? Because Wes Streeting's argument was never he's more principled than Keir Starmer. It's that he's better at communicating. Now principles are front and centre. That's not going to be great for him. So if you were sort of a new Labour right person, this is bad on every front. Let's look at more email exchanges between Mandelson and Epstein, which have been coming to light today. And of course, you know, this isn't because there have been more releases. It's because the quantity of the emails which have been released means that it's taking a while for journalists to sort of, I suppose, find all the interesting ones. If you go, anyone can do it, by the way. You can go on the US Department of Justice website and go through the Epstein files. But every time you put in a name, it will give you sort of 10,000 results, and often lots of them look very similar. So it does take quite a while to trawl through it, which is why these revelations will keep coming. So these are new exchanges from Epstein and Mandelson. This first one, this is unbelievable. It's from the day Jeffrey Epstein was released from prison in 2009. And he had just been released from prison, of course, after being convicted for procuring sex from children. And this is the email. So Mandelson writes, how is freedom feeling? And Jeffrey Epstein says, she feels fresh, firm, and creamy. And then Mandelson says, naughty boy. Which is the day he's released from prison. This is while he is business secretary and deputy prime minister. We also know Epstein used his connections with Mandelson to try and lobby the US government as well as the UK government, which is crazy because Jeffrey Epstein is very well connected in the US government as well. But still, it helped, I suppose, to have a government minister pressuring the Americans. The context here is that after the financial crisis, the US government was in the process of tightening regulations on banks. Epstein wanted Mandelson, who was then business secretary, of course, to pressure the Americans not to do that. So this is an email from Jeffrey Epstein to Peter Mandelson. I would like you to ask Larry Summers if he would meet directly with Jez, that's Jez Stanley of JP Morgan, and another JP Morgan person, re the proposed Volcker rule. So the Volcker rule was going to be this bank regulation. I can't do it directly, but he says Larry is getting info third and fourth hand from senators who are getting it from lobbyists. Now this one is peculiar because, I mean, one of the people who seems to be as close with Jeffrey Epstein as Peter Mandelson is Larry Summers. So I don't know why he needed Peter Mandelson to speak to Larry Summers for him, but he says, I can't do it directly for whatever reason. And so he is, enrolling his friend, UK Trade Minister, to lobby the American government to go softer on the banks. Remember, this is a Labour government in the UK who's pressuring the White House to go softer on bank regulation after the financial crisis. Mandelson then gets briefing notes from Jez Stanley. So as I say, he was head of JP Morgan and close associate of Epstein. Jez Stanley, or Staley, sorry, not Stanley, Jez Staley, says to Peter Mandelson, Peter, what follows are some brief speaking points that we would use in discussing the Volcker plan with Summers. We can speak to them when we talk tonight. And then under that, we're just showing you the top, but under that, there's a bunch of talking points. The kind of talking points you can imagine from a financier that doesn't want regulation, or suppress competition, The Financial Times, in fact, report that a later memo from a meeting between Mandelson and Larry Summers indicated that the UK business secretary did, in fact, go on to raise those talking points. Aaron, these are going to keep coming out. I suppose your thoughts on these newest emails.
Well, it's completely at odds with everything that Peter Mandelson has said in the public arena regarding his relationship with Epstein towards the end after he was arrested. And this goes all the way through to 2012. And what I think that tells us more broadly is the man is a pathological liar. He's very comfortable with lying, which makes me return to the point I raised a few minutes ago. This can't just be a one-off. We get all these messages really from 2008 onwards between Epstein and Mandelson, when Mandelson was effectively the second most powerful person in the cabinet after Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Of course, you had Alistair Darling as the Chancellor, but Mandelson, I think, was in 45 or 51, cabinet subcommittees. Incredibly powerful figure in that government. He was brought in for precisely that reason, to be the trade and industry czar by Gordon Brown. And I can't not believe that he wasn't doing similar things as the EU Trade Commissioner. Or the European Commissioner for Trade, I should say, because it's out of the EU Commission, isn't it? It really does defy belief. And somebody who's this comfortable with lying, I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of it, because he will have lied to so many people about so many things on so many different occasions. And like I say, this is just one person, which is coming to sort of percolating through to the public conversation. But again, we wouldn't have any of this if it was just the British system at play. We only are in receipt of this information because of what US Congress did. They passed a piece of bipartisan legislation so that all of these documents, or most of them at least, certainly with some changes and some parts screened out, but for the most part, we're seeing a lot of documents. I think 3 million pages, of 5,600 mentions of Peter Mandelson. It's a lot of information, and that's all because of the American system. There is so much of this in our politics in this country, Michael, and I think a lot of it has to do with our electoral system. We have a two-party system where you're either the government or the opposition. You can't really fall that far. That might be changing now with reform of the Green Party, of course. And what that does is it rewards nepotism, game playing, being able to spoil your opponent, rather than actually being able to build things, do things. So I think it underpins a failing sort of political system, incapable of solving big problems, addressing challenges, but also very insular, very contemptuous of the wider public. And fundamentally, and this is what really you get from all of these communications, Michael, there's a presumption of impunity. There are never real meaningful consequences for anyone. And I do think actually a big cue in that regard, a big enormous cue, was the Iraq War. I do think people like Mandelson, a generation of New Labour politicians, saw what happened. We prosecuted an illegal war. Nothing happened to Blair. Nothing happened to George W. Bush. Nothing happened to them. And so you get these kinds of communications where, Mandelson says naughty boy in response to a paedophile saying she feels fresh, firm and creamy. He's talking about sexually, although in a quote unquote joking way, he's talking about sexually assaulting children. And you have a member of the government saying naughty boy.
I mean, it's not clear he's talking about sexually assaulting children there, but yeah, he was someone who's just been released from prison.
How is Freedom feeling? That's what he's just been released from prison for. I think it's a reasonable inference. Of course, I'm sure Peter Mandelson would say that's not correct. And for the lawyers watching, I mean, okay, fine, but that would be my personal inference from what's written there.
In the early hours of the 6th of August 2024, 6 activists from Palestine Action targeted Elbit Systems, an Israeli manufacturer in Bristol. This is some footage that was released by the group showing their action at the time. So I should do a correction. I said 6 people. There are actually 24 people taking part in the action, but there are 6 people who have been on trial where the verdict has just come in. So for that action, the 6 we're talking about here were charged with aggravated burglary, criminal damage and violent disorder. And one of the protesters was charged with grievous bodily harm. That was after that person had allegedly struck a police officer with a sledgehammer. Today, however, a jury has cleared them all on counts of aggravated burglary. And on the charges of criminal damage and violent disorder, the jury reached partial or no verdicts, which means there could be a retrial. And they also reached no verdict on the one count of grievous bodily harm, which again means if the CPS decides, there could be a retrial. I think that outcome has surprised many people. I spoke earlier to Stephen Meffin to describe what we should understand about these verdicts.
So today, the 6 defendants in this case, in the Filton case, the first of the Filton cases, have been found, all of them not guilty of aggravated burglary, and that's a charge which involves, breaking into a premises with a weapon of offence, it's called. So, in a sense, with the intention of violence or intimidation. The jury's acquitted them all of that charge. The remaining charges were criminal damage and violent disorder. On the criminal damage charge, all 6, no verdict has been returned. So the jury wasn't able to reach a decision. And on the violent disorder charge, 3 of them, Charlotte Head, Leona Cameo and Samuel Corner, returned no verdict, and on the other 3, found them not guilty. And then Samuel Corner, was also charged with grievous bodily harm with intent for allegedly hitting a female police officer with a hammer. The jury was unable to return a verdict on that. And the setting here is that the judge initially asked for a unanimous verdict. At some point, that wasn't forthcoming and turned it into, was satisfied with a majority verdict, so 10 out of 12 at least agreeing, and that still wasn't reached in these cases. So, we will never know what the jury's deliberations were, and we can't ask, and that is completely private forever, even to the judge. But it is in some ways telling that on the criminal damage charge, which is the one where, in order for that to be the case, you just have to have damaged deliberately someone else's property. Even on that charge, the verdict wasn't, the jury wasn't able to return a guilty verdict for any of them. I think that's a very interesting feature of the case.
And so, I suppose to break this down, the aggravated burglary, them all being found not guilty of that seems pretty straightforward, because aggravated burglary requires them to have gone into this building with the intent to use their sledgehammers to threaten people, I suppose. And the jury accepted that, no, they went into this building to use the sledgehammers to damage property. And where there are allegations of them having been used in a more violent manner, that was not part of the plan. That was when the plan went a bit haywire from sort of the reporting I've read. Yes, on this violent disorder one, let's focus on not violent disorder, on the criminal damage one. Let's focus on criminal damage, because this is the one, they admit they went in there and damaged other people's property. So the fact that there was no verdict, does this suggest that members of the jury thought that even though on the face of it they had damaged some property, they were trying to prevent a greater crime, that of, Israel's genocidal war against the Palestinians, and therefore, even if on the face of it this was criminal damage, it was justified? I mean, as you say, we'll never know exactly what they thought, but presumably that's the only way that you could not find them guilty for criminal damage.
I mean, yeah, it's important that. So I guess what you're imagining here is that some jurors simply decided to, not find them guilty or find them not guilty on grounds other than the law, and conscience perhaps, or that they believed the law in this case was in fact an ass, or any number of reasons. As you say, we won't know. Never will know, and nor should any juror ever say what their reasons are for having found, or even say what they voted on the end. But in the judge's directions to the jury, he said that on the reasoning in law that should be applied in the case of criminal damage, the jury should have no problem. In fact, the jury obviously did have a problem. They did have a problem with finding a majority of them, these defendants, guilty in that case. I think it's clear that whatever reasoning was involved there was not, doesn't seem to have been reasoning on the evidence, because, I think it's fairly clear. But that is a power that juries have. They have the power to decide however they wish in a case. And that power arises from the fact that the judge can't direct them to bring back a guilty verdict, and nor can they ever be asked or punished for the verdicts that they bring forward. So there is a power that a jury has to sort of do whatever it wants in respect of verdicts.
I suppose on these, the violent disorder and the grievous bodily harm case, these, we were talking earlier, these are cases where there was no verdict, so the prosecutor may decide to retry, to sort of call for a retry, which means that this is still to some degree an active case. So there's only so we can't talk completely openly about it. But there was recently a piece of footage put out by the prosecution, which led many people on social media, often people who weren't fans of the Palestinian cause, but for whatever reason, led people on social media to suggest that this was very clearly a very violent action. We'll just show a minute of that.
There's sting from both of us. Put it down.
Get out! Get the fuck out! It's not going to be man! Fuck off! Fuck off! Fuck off! Wait! One over there! Ow! Mate! What did I fucking say? Hey! Fucking...
Don't care. Not taking shit, no more.
Fuck off!
Give it now.
Mate, drop that now! Fucking drop that fucking thing now! Drop that! Stop! Messing around.
That really fucking hurt!
Yes, you're messing. Get your fucking. Stephen, as you say, we don't know what the jury sort of were thinking about when they made the decision, or I suppose failed to make their decision, or when each juror made their decision. Lots of people on social media saw that and thought open and shut case. Clearly, the jurors haven't agreed. What were the kind of arguments put forward in court when it came to this? So obviously the defence had to put forward an argument saying that this isn't necessarily what it might otherwise have seemed. Talk to me about that.
The important, I was on the show when that footage came out and talked about it at the time, and I said, a lot of people are drawing conclusions from the footage, which is essentially the prosecution's footage, right? So that's a compilation put together by the prosecution, and evidence in the courtroom is going to turn on a lot of different things. So, for example, what were people thinking at the time? What were the surrounding circumstances at the time? Something that looks like one thing on a piece of footage can, turn out to be something very different when the context is added, when people are discussing, when there's further information provided about what else was going on in those circumstances. If anyone wants to, they can go and read the reporting on the case. The way a court works is that it's the prosecution's job to prove the case against the defendants. It's not the defendant's case to prove their innocence. And so therefore, the way that a defense works is by elaborating on or finding holes in or taking apart what the prosecution is presenting. And that is what the defense will have done in this case. And in the case of aggravated burglary, they'll have done that successfully. And in the case of violent disorder, successfly in the case of 3 of the defendants. And in the other case of the other 3, the jury was not able to decide based on one presumes, at least partially, the defense put forward by the prosecution. It's worth saying that one of the defendants, Jordan Devlin, didn't himself give any evidence at all because he, I assume, wanted to leave it to the prosecution to make the case and to believe that they weren't going to be able to do it, and he was found not guilty of violent disorder. There is something to technicality about violent disorder, by the way, which is that it has to involve 3 people in the same place at the same time, doing actions which would, cause a reasonable person to fear or become intimidated. And it's interesting that in the cases, the division in the 6, where 3 of them the jury's been unable to return a verdict, and 3 they found them not guilty. And I think that may also have to do with the location of them at various times during the action. But of course, the aggravated burglary charge, of which they've all been found not guilty, does involve this question of intent to cause harm or to intimidate, or there's a threat of violence in it, and I think that is what the jury has decided was not there. Although, as I say, we will never know how they made up their minds.
I mean, you said people can go away and read the court reporting. I suppose just to briefly sort of summarise it from I haven't looked directly at it, but from sort of the newspaper articles I've read, it seems as if one of the defence's argument when it came to things like grievous bodily harm was that this was a situation of just intense confusion. So what might have looked like an attack was in fact someone who'd, for example, just been sprayed with something and was confused and didn't really know what they were doing, and that lots of that footage actually just showed people in a sort of confusing, chaotic situation where they didn't really know what they were doing, and it was just all a bit of a mess.
I think that sort of in detail goes to the question of whether, in the case of grievous bodily harm with intent, that there was an intent there to hurt somebody badly. And again, it's just one of the defendants, Samuel Corner, who was charged with grievous bodily harm with intent. And it's the prosecution's job to prove that intent was there. It's not the defense's job to prove that it wasn't. So, that's I guess the kind of detail that you're talking about there is a sort of detail which makes the picture presented in the footage that was aired publicly more complicated, and complicated enough for, in this case, in the aggravated burglary charge, for the jury to find them all not guilty, and complicated enough in the grievous bodily harm case with Samuel Corner to have not been able to reach a verdict on it.
Since the Epstein files were released over the weekend, we've done segments on Peter Mandelson, Prince Andrew, Bill Gates and Tony Blair. Not characters Novara viewers tend to have much affinity with. But in the millions of emails released from Epstein's accounts, it's not just billionaires, royalty and Blairites who come off with their reputations damaged. Yes, leftist icon Noam Chomsky was also remarkably close with the billionaire paedophile. Now he's pictured here on his private plane. Now, the close relationship between Chomsky and Epstein has been public for a while, and the image we just showed you was part of a tranche of documents released late last year. But this latest release contains emails that show just how close the relationship was. Now, lots of these screenshotted emails I'm showing you here are from or via the journalist Anna McLeod. So where there are highlights, they're his. So these are just some emails. This is from Noam Chomsky in 2016, still eager to make it to the Caribbean. Then we can go on to the following month, which was upgraded to Chomsky really fantasizing about Epstein's Caribbean island. A year later, Chomsky's wife, Valeria, received an email saying, quote, "Thank you so very much for helping to make Jeffrey's birthday booklet even more special. He was thrilled and touched by it. Please do pass along to Noam." It's clear from these emails that Epstein and Chomsky met on multiple occasions and had a pretty close relationship. In 2015, Epstein paid for Chomsky and his wife to stay in a $1,400 a night Manhattan hotel suite. Paying back the hospitality in 2016, Chomsky informed Epstein that his wife Valeria had prepared Epstein's favorite dessert. And this is perhaps the most damning email of all. It's from 2019. So it's an email from Noam Chomsky to Jeffrey Epstein in 2019. So quite a lot had come to light by then. So he writes, "I've watched the horrible way you are being treated in the press and public. It's painful to say, but I think the best way to proceed is to ignore it. I've had plenty of experience, though of course not on this scale. A Google search will bring up tons of hysterical accusations of all sorts, even groups devoted to vilifying me. I pay no attention unless I'm approached for a comment on a specific matter. It's a nuisance, but it's the best way. The same conclusions from experiences of others, in some cases close friends. What the vultures dearly want is a public response, which then provides a public opening for an onslaught of venomous attacks, many from just publicity seekers or cranks of all sorts, which are impossible to answer. How do you prove that you are not a neo-Nazi who wants to kill the Jews, or a rapist, or whatever charges come along? That's particularly true now with the hysteria that has developed about the abuse of women, which has reached the point that even questioning a charge is a crime worse than murder. For virtually anyone who sees any of this, the reaction will be, where there's smoke, there's fire, maybe raging fire, whatever the facts, which few will even think of investigating. In general, it's best, I think, not to react unless directly questioned, particularly in the current mood, which I presume will fade away, even if not in time to prevent much torture and distress. Hard to say, but it's the best advice I can think of. No. Aaron, when we're, it's important to say, Noam Chomsky, there's no suggestion that he went to Epstein's pedo island and had sex with anyone, right? There's lots and lots of exchanges between Chomsky and Epstein where we can get quite a good idea of what the relationship was. And it seemed to be a relationship where they had developed a close friendship, where Chomsky met lots of interesting people via Epstein. Epstein enjoyed having this eminent scholar sort of as a friend. And Noam Chomsky was very defensive of Epstein, who by 2019, not only had he been convicted of procuring sex with a minor, there was also reporting in 2008 about how some of those people were as young as 14, and there were numerous people. Part of the sort of the sweet deal given to him by the prosecutor in 2008 was that the charges were somewhat ambiguous. It was procuring sex with a minor, someone under 18, which allowed lots of people to say, oh, it was probably just a 17-and-a-half-year-old, and say the reporting was just salacious, which wasn't true, of course, but that's, I think, how people justified their friendship. By 2019, a lot had come out about Jeffrey Epstein, and Noam Chomsky is still saying, essentially he thinks it's a bit of a witch hunt. Aaron, how do you respond?
Well, I think judging from that final screenshot you just read out, sort of lengthy email, it does seem like Chomsky is trying to comprehend the situation through the prism of cancel culture. And he's probably bringing his own biases and preferences to that because, of course, over the 2010s, there's this big conversation about cancel culture and what you should do to people when they err, the moral zealotry sometimes of progressives and people on the left, which Chomsky had critiqued. And I think he's applying some of those conversations to this. I also think he was just seduced by the glamour. Anybody can be. There's a great anecdote from Yanis Varoufakis where he says, once you fly on business class, you think you deserve it, right? You're flying on economy, you're on Ryanair, EasyJet, and then you fly, Air Emirates business class, a $20,000 flight, and then you have to go back to your old life and you think, hold on, I'm better than this. And that can happen to anyone. As Marx said, conditions determine consciousness. And I do think that pretty much anyone could be subject to making bad calls because of being in this reified world. I'd also say that if you're not part of a wider political movement where people cannot call you out, because I don't think that's necessarily productive, but call you in, have conversations, tie you to reality, challenge you, hold you accountable, like my colleagues do here at Novara Media, as one example, or you might get in a political party or in a business. I think if you don't have that, this kind of stuff happens more frequently. Finally, this is appalling. This is appalling, and people should make absolutely no excuses for it. But it's important to say that, Chomsky, and in a way this is added context, is in many ways the most important left-wing figure in the post-Cold War world. I remember being a 15-year-old in Bournemouth in a Borders bookshop, and you would have Noam Chomsky, Understanding Power. You could buy that book in little old Bournemouth. So this guy has been so fundamental to helping shape people's views, politics, preferences, but that doesn't take away from what's happening here. I'd also add one final point, which is he's really old. I wonder how that figures, because I've never spoken to the man. I don't know him. But did his judgment of people deteriorate with age? I have no idea. I mean, people that are closer to him will have to answer that. But I do find it supremely ironic and troubling in a way that such an intelligent man who was such an outstanding voice for left-wing and progressive causes was palling around with something like Jeffrey Epstein. It does help discredit the wider left. If that man hasn't got principles, do any of us? And of course, many people do.
Well, also, I suppose, does it discredit, because I think lots of people look at this through the Epstein files and everything through a partisan lens. So you see sort of Mandelson, was still willing to be friends with him after he was convicted. That's because Blairites have no morals. And so you make it about this political distinction. So it's only right-wing people, or it's only billionaire tech people who are willing to hang around with someone who's been convicted of that kind of thing. Does this make it seem like actually maybe it's not as closely aligned with politics as some people might like to think?
I think it kind of is aligned with politics, but not in its entirety. I can't imagine somebody like Mick Lynch thinking it's okay for a billionaire financier, puck the paedophile bit for a minute, even an upstanding person, to pay for his hotel suite that's $1,400. I just think certain people say, you know what, I'm a successful person in my own right, I have money, you don't need to pay for me, there's no such thing as a free lunch. I think that's quite a common sense position.
We know some trade union leaders who got quite expensive flights and hotels paid for.
Well, let's park that for a moment. But no, I think when you're as successful as Chomsky, do you really need somebody else to pay for your hotel suites? I mean, it's ridiculous, frankly. He's a very successful man. He's a grandfather. He's with his wife. Why does this man need to pay for your hotel room? It's like with Starmer getting free specs and free dresses for his wife from Lord Walid Ali. I mean, it's just ridiculous. You're a grown man, for goodness sake.
Well, as a clue, I mean, we should also say, I mean, it's unfortunate because this is all coming out while Chomsky is still alive, but seems to be incapacitated to some degree, seems to be sort of so ill that he's unable to respond. He has, though, in the previous set of files which were released, there is a sort of open letter written by Noam Chomsky vouching for Jeffrey Epstein, which I suppose also gives some insight into what Chomsky got out of the relationship, or what he thought he was getting out of the relationship. So we'll read that. So it says, "To whom it may concern, I met Jeffrey Epstein half a dozen years ago. We have been in regular contact since, with many long and often in-depth discussions about a very wide range of topics, including our own specialities and professional work, but a host of others where we have shared interests. It has been a most valuable experience for me. In the area of his own direct engagements, I have learned a great deal from him about the intricacies of the global financial system, about complex technical issues that arise in the often arcane world of finance, and about specific cases in which I have a particular interest, such as the financial situation in Saudi Arabia and current economic planning and prospects there. Jeffrey invariably turns out to be a highly reliable source with intimate knowledge and perceptive analysis, commonly going well beyond what I can find in the business press and professional journals. Turning to my own special interest in linguistics, cognitive science and philosophy of language and mind, Jeffrey constantly raises searching questions and puts forth provocative ideas which have repeatedly led me to rethink critical issues. It goes on, given the range and depth of his concerns, I suppose I should not have been surprised to discover that Jeffrey has repeatedly been able to arrange, sometimes on the spot, very productive meetings with leading figures in the sciences and mathematics and global politics, people whose work and activities I had looked into, though I had never expected to meet them. Once, when we were discussing the Oslo agreements, Jeffrey picked up the phone and called the Norwegian diplomat who supervised them, leading to a lively interchange. On another occasion, Jeffrey arranged a meeting with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, whose record I had studied carefully and written about. We have our disagreements, but had a very fruitful discussion about a number of controversial matters, including one that was of particular interest to me, the TAPPLE negotiations of January 2001, in the framework of President Clinton's parameters events that remain obscure and controversial because the diplomatic record is still mostly secret. Barak's discussion of the background was illuminating, also surprising in some ways. In very different areas, much the same was true in meetings Jeffrey arranged with evolutionary biologists, neuroscientists, mathematicians, and computer scientists. Several of them engaged in exciting work at the limits of understanding in their fields, sometimes with perspectives quite different from mine. More lively interchanges in which Jeffrey was once again an active participant, often an effective gadfly. The impact of Jeffrey's limitless curiosity, extensive knowledge, penetrating insights, and thoughtful appraisals is only heightened by his easy informality without a trace of pretentiousness. He quickly became a highly valued friend and regular source of intellectual exchange and stimulation. Let's look at what one of Chomsky's acolytes made of this letter when it was first published last year. So Glenn Greenwald is a journalist who, like Chomsky, has spent years casting a critical eye on US power and foreign policy. He says he looks up to Chomsky professionally and personally knew him well.
Chomsky's human, and we all have these temptations of money and power and the allure that it presents. It's not the case that Chomsky is typically sought after by members of this global elite. I mean, again, he's certainly someone very influential. He has a lot of friends who are, like Lula. But not this kind of global moneyed elite. So maybe he was dazzled by Jeffrey Epstein's interest in him, or he had a lot of institutional loyalty to MIT. Maybe Jeffrey Epstein's pouring money into MIT. Who knows? I don't know what to make of it. I'm just saying it must be the case that Jeffrey Epstein had some sort of interpersonal skills that were quite exceptional. I talked before about how people behave around billionaires. It's shocking. Like people who you wouldn't think would do this. I'm not talking about people who work for them, but anybody. It's like that level of wealth and power becomes so captivating to human beings. It's one of the reasons why I think a lot of billionaires go crazy, because they can't be around people who treat them in a normal way. Everything is just constant sycophantic affirmation. But if you ever listen to Chomsky talk about oligarchs and powerful and wealthy people, he does so with this scorn and contempt that would make you think that he would be immune to that kind of courtship. But apparently not. There's no doubt he was very close friends with Jeffrey Epstein and had a great deal of respect and admiration for him.
That was Glenn Greenwald. I mean, I suppose the most sympathetic way of looking at it is that he met loads of interesting people who had been writing about, and so it sort of enhanced his understanding of the world. And I suppose you could say, well, why couldn't he have taken those introductions without all the friendly stuff? I suppose the only way you get those introductions is to do the friendly stuff. I mean, at the same time, he clearly just was good friends with Jeffrey Epstein.
I think this really underscores how expert Epstein was at finding your vulnerability as a person. Clearly, he could captivate somebody like Noam Chomsky through adding value in this manner. You get to speak to world-leading neuroscientists, the former Israeli PM, the Norwegian diplomat who was responsible for this or that negotiation regarding Israel-Palestine. And that was what Chomsky wanted. And the genius of Epstein, and clearly he was very, very smart at doing this, as was just hinted at there by Glenn, is that he could do this for anybody and everybody. You know, pauper and prince, literally, in the case of Prince Andrew. So that's the first point. And I think that's being very charitable to Chomsky, but it's also revealing of a broader issue with Epstein and how he managed to do what he was able to do. Secondly, though, you know, that comment we had from a communication between Epstein and Chomsky we saw a moment ago, I'm really fantasizing about the Caribbean island. That doesn't sound like somebody who's wanting to talk to, you know, peer-reviewed scholars and world-leading neuroscientists. That's somebody who just wants to have a nice time with a guy he really gets on with. And I'm sure, again, Epstein in many ways was captivating and fascinating. We all love to be around interesting people, actually. And you don't always have to agree with them. Some of the people I have the best conversations with, I don't agree with them. But here's where I think there's a jumping off point. And that's on that email from 2019, where Chomsky is responding to Epstein in such a way that is clearly inappropriate for all of the things that were already a matter of public record. So look, you don't need to cancel Chomsky on this. I think this reveals a broader lesson which we can all learn from. It also, I think, exposes, like I say, the genius of Epstein. But we shouldn't make excuses for somebody who sent that message on February 23rd, 2019, which was effectively diminishing sexual assault. I mean, it's a really, really serious thing, particularly for somebody with that much wisdom. You know, I'm somebody who thinks that generally speaking, the older you get, the wiser you become. And that to me is the most striking thing here, which, you know, I can only conclude he was really taken in by Epstein.
I suppose in terms of being consistent here, so with Peter Mandelson, clearly what we know now is that he had a very different relationship to Jeffrey Epstein than did Noam Chomsky, right? They're sort of making sexual jokes. There's clearly a sort of quid pro quo where basically Mandelson is giving him information and that's going to be helpful for Mandelson to become very rich in the future. So from what we know now, I think these files make Mandelson look a lot worse than Noam Chomsky. However, from what we know now, what we knew about Mandelson, say, a year ago is quite similar to what we know about Noam Chomsky here. If anything, what we knew about Mandelson a year ago was better than what we know about Chomsky here because, you know, there weren't any sort of long letters where he was explicitly defending what Epstein had done. So in terms of Keir Starmer, say, knowing that Peter Mandelson had been friends with Jeffrey Epstein after the conviction, he probably also was told, you know, look, Jeffrey Epstein was a very interesting, engaging guy who could introduce you to interesting people. So I suppose if we're speaking sympathetically of Noam Chomsky here, should we not be more forgiving of Keir Starmer making Peter Mandelson US ambassador a year and a half ago?
Well, I think with Mandelson it's different because he does have this hinterland and this record of being somebody who repeatedly falls short when it comes to moral standards. He had to resign twice.
So you don't give him the benefit of the doubt because of that background information?
Well, quite. But again, and I think responding to what you said there, Epstein clearly looked at individuals as assets, as resources. And of course, Mandelson was a resource because he could give him market-sensitive information while being in a position of political influence and authority, whether that was in government, as in 2008, with Brown, or maybe, as we'll potentially see going forward, as a EU Commissioner for Trade. What Chomsky was probably an asset to leverage when he wanted to impress policymakers or people in finance. Wow, you've got the MIT scholar, Noam Chomsky, one of the most cited academics, I think maybe the most cited academic in the English-speaking world ever. I could be completely wrong. He's certainly up there. I think he's top 3.
It's often said about him.
He's top 3. He's up there, right? Highly cited academic. So I think, you know, Chomsky was still very much a resource for Epstein. And that's clearly a very flexible way of looking at people, being able to leverage them. These were chips, Michael, for Epstein. This man was a psychological expert, and I think he played these people very, very well by appealing to whatever he thought motivated them and incentivized them. But like I say, once that stuff is out in the public domain, you should not be doing that. And of course, you're right. This is kind of similar to what Mandelson was saying in terms of what was in the public domain until quite recently. But when you're seeking public office, or when you're seeking to represent a country on the diplomatic stage, as Mandelson was by seeking to become the ambassador of Britain to Washington, I think you obviously have to have a high threshold.
Yeah. Also, I think this probably would be disqualifying for giving Chomsky a significant job at this point, right? He shouldn't necessarily be you don't have to burn his books, but once you found all of this about Chomsky, you're not making him the dean of a university, are you? And I suppose, you know, Peter Mandelson was made the ambassador to the United States. Someone who comes off much better than Epstein in these files is Norman Finkelstein. So the context here is instructive. So I'll do some explaining. In 2015, The Guardian reported on a number of charities who were turning their backs on Jeffrey Epstein. It was at this point that accusations were surfacing against Epstein from victims like Virginia Giuffre, and charities were seeking to cut ties with the billionaire. But the article also included a defense of Epstein from Robert Trivers. Now, he's a prominent Rutgers University biologist. This is from that 2015 article in The Guardian. Did he get an easy deal? Did he buy himself a light sentence? Well, yes, probably, compared to what you or I would get. But he did get locked up, Trivers said. He said he got $40,000 from Epstein to study the relationship between knee symmetry and sprinting ability. Trivers also said he believes girls mature earlier than in the past. Quote, by the time they're 14 or 15, they're like grown women were 60 years ago. So I don't see these acts as so heinous, he said. So, I mean, this is, again, it's sort of seeing how did people justify being friends with Jeffrey Epstein or getting money from Jeffrey Epstein. This is a very, very prominent biologist at Rutgers University who in 2015 tells The Guardian that 14 and 15-year-old girls are like adults were 60 years ago. For some reason, they're aging quicker. So that's the defense of him. And in response to that, Trivers gets a very angry email and a very well-put email from another academic. This one's called Joseph R. Cheney. He says this: is this claim regarding teenage girls your scientific opinion? If so, I'd like to see the research supporting your idea that a girl of 14 is as mature emotionally and psychologically as an adult woman in the 1950s. The real problem with the statement, though, is the way in which it places blame for child abuse on the child and excuses the criminal actions of an adult sexual predator, a man who was a serial rapist of children. Your claim about 14 and 15-year-olds is clearly wrong in the legal sense, but it is also wrong and dangerous as a claim about maturity. Any parent of a teenager can tell you that teens are not like adults. They have not yet internalized a sense of authority. They still depend largely on the judgment and guidance of adults who praise them for their obedience more than for their independence of mind. This means that they are too easily impressed by and manipulated by adults, especially those whom they view as important and powerful. Teenage girls, no matter how capable of sexual activity they may be, are not yet morally responsible persons. They are a vulnerable class of people that the law rightly protects from potential predators and abusers. I believe that your affection for Jeffrey Epstein has led you to make light of his heinous crimes. That's an email to Joseph R. Cheney to Robert Trivers. So Joseph R. Cheney also comes off very, very well. I mean, the Epstein files. But I suppose I'm more interested in Norman Finkelstein because I know who he is and I know you know who he is too. So what happens next? Well, Robert Trivers at this point seems to find this pushback from Joseph R. Cheney ridiculous. And for some reason, he emails Finkelstein for support. So the email he's got from Joseph R. Cheney, he forwards to Norman Finkelstein and says, damn, I thought a heinous crime was the US invasion of Iraq 2003, or at least murder, rape and pillage. So he's looking for affirmation from Norman Finkelstein saying, isn't this guy Joseph R. Cheney being, ridiculous, making this seem like such a big deal? I suppose he knows that Norman Finkelstein is someone who's sort of against cancel culture and moralizing, so he's expecting him to back him up. In fact, what Norman Finkelstein replies is he gets a quote from the testimony of Jane Doe number 3. Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz was around Epstein frequently. Dershowitz was so comfortable with the sex that was going on that he would even come and chat with Epstein while I was giving oral sex to Epstein. So that's testimony from one of the accusers. Obviously, Alan Dershowitz denies that. But then Norman Finkelstein says, my guess is if Epstein put your daughter at age 15 in such a position, you wouldn't publicly describe him as a friend and person of integrity. In fact, I would hope that you'd promptly throttle both Epstein and Dershowitz. Aaron, you've met Norman Finkelstein recently. Are you surprised that he's come off quite well in these files? I'm
not surprised in the slightest. Norman Finkelstein is an incredible person. You can't sink the think, Michael. I've always said it. And it's true, this idea, of course, yes, a young person might reach sexual maturity at a certain age, male or female. They might reach puberty at younger ages for whatever ambient reasons or biological reasons or whatever. People are getting taller over generations. You might say that for a range of issues. But if somebody said to me, hey, you know what? 14-year-old girls today are like women 60 years ago. My instinct would be, I don't want you anywhere near children. No, seriously.
Yeah,
we should check your computer hard drive. I would just presume they're a paedophile. I mean, maybe that's unfair, or they're disposed to pedophilia. That would be my kind of operating presumption. A 14-year-old is a child. I'm somebody who's 42. Personally, and look, I'm not here to judge people that do legal things, but personally, I find it strange if somebody my age is in a relationship with a young woman who's 20. I find that strange. I mean, I don't know how you have a conversation. I'm 42. I find it, slightly odd. The idea that you would have it with somebody who's 14 or 15, I can't really grasp. So I'm very much on Team Norm here, and I think most people, of course, are on Team Norm. I think as well, once you have people in your life of that age, whether it's a niece or a daughter, I mean, obviously already disgust you, but particularly as a man, I can't think of many things that are more disgusting, because in a way it's quite evasive and slippery, right? You're not saying something which is openly contemptible. You're saying, well, actually, the legal age of, sexual consent is 16 or 18, depending where you are, but really it should be 14. I just think, what's going on here? Like, what's your agenda? And like I say, I would probably only conclude that they are effectively pro-paedophile, which, by the way, those people exist, right? We had it in this country, the paedophile information exchange. People were making a quote-unquote political argument for pedophilia. I think this is kind of an extension of that.
Yeah, 'cause it's about the context, right? If you're discussing what should be the policy when teenagers have sex with teenagers, right? And should you be prosecuting a 14-year-old for having sex with a 13-year-old, whatever, then say, okay, people are maturing a bit quicker than they were because they're better fed now than they were in the 1950s. Relevant argument. If you're saying, should this 50-year-old be transporting this 14-year-old to his island to have sex with them? Completely irrelevant argument. The moment you start saying maybe 14-year-olds are actually grown women is the moment I think, yes, you're probably a paedophile.
But when does that become normal? I wonder what kind of circles you have to be in for that to become normal. And clearly, you said about people are looking at this through a sort of ideological lens. So they say Epstein, Mandelson, this is a problem with people on the right. I do think this is clearly a problem with people who are in elite circles. They clearly think they are different to the rest of society. You see it with Peter Thiel, some of the communications he's had with Epstein. You see it with Elon Musk just generally. I'm not suggesting Elon Musk agrees with these particular statements, but they do view themselves as quite distinct from the wider public. And I kind of think that as a warped psychology maps onto an economy which is defined by ever-increasing inequality over time. They look at other people who are perhaps different to them socially, economically, as in a way subhuman. Would he want his daughter at 14 to be sleeping with a 50-year-old man? I struggle to believe that, and if that was the case, then that child should not be in his guardianship.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not just elites. You also have grooming gangs. You have the Catholic Church, right? There are all different situations where you can effectively dehumanize an other and sort of find grotesque justifications for your own gratification. But yeah, I mean, it does seem like there is something when it comes with this much power where people
I would say the common theme with all those is an idea that you are immune from consequences. Yeah. And of course, when you're very wealthy and powerful, when you have outstanding lawyers, when you have a private island to do this away from the prying eyes of the press, when you have good friends at very high levels of politics and policy and thought leadership and culture, I think that sense of immunity from consequences percolates through all of it. And I do, by the way, think that's a problem with the Labour right. I know we're not talking about that today necessarily. It's what we've been talking about yesterday and on Monday's show. But I do think Mandelson, I'm not suggesting everybody on the Labour right is like Mandelson, this soft on paedophiles specifically. But I do think there is a sense that the Labour right as a political faction in this country's public life do generally view themselves as being exempt from consequences. And I do think a big jumping off point was Blair and Iraq. They just do not think that the consequences that apply to everyone else apply to them. And I think this was like a snowball to such an extent that, Mandelson in 2008 would have a meeting or get an email from very senior people inside government, and within minutes, it's almost like a compulsion. He couldn't wait to send it off to Epstein. And I do think that's an outgrowth of the political culture we see on the Labour right, particularly.
We are going to have to wrap up there. We'll save Elon Musk either for tomorrow or Friday's show. Aaron, it has been a pleasure being joined by you tonight.
It's been a pleasure. These are huge stories. Huge stories, Michael.
Huge stories. Lots of you watching as well. Big audience. 3,500 of you watching live. Thank you so much. We will be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, thank you for watching Novara Media. Good night.